As we previously saw in the video, voters tend either to adopt a calculator approach to work out the costs and benefits of EU membership, or else they focus on the question of control. That second approach is associated with the preference for leaving the EU because this could bring back control over a number of policy areas. The main and most appealing policy area that could come back under British control concerns immigration. In fact, there's a lot of data that shows how voters' attitude towards immigration shape their overall position on EU membership. Here's an image that captures the role immigration concerns play in shaping how British voters think about EU membership. The image comes from a tweet by Matthew Goodwin, who is a professor at the University of Kent and a leading expert on UK voting behaviour. If you are on Twitter, I'd recommend following him, and watch out for his book on the referendum, which will be published after the vote. What we see from this bar chart is the way that British voters are polarised. On the one hand, there are voters for whom the economy is the main factor in determining how to vote. They are on the Remain side. On the other hand, those who think immigration is the most important question at stake, they support the Leave camp. What we have, in other words, is a core group of voters who think completely differently about the same issue. That helps explain why, if you recall the earlier image showing the evolution of the poll of polls, there's such a solid number of voters in either camp. This is a good opportunity to reflect in more detail on how the current referendum campaign compares with the one held in 1975 over whether the UK should remain in the European Economic Community, the EEC. Back then, the early polling figures showed a slight majority in favour of leaving, which sounds like the country was similarly polarised as it is today. The fundamental turning point was the government's renegotiation, which was finalised in April 1975. Along with a strong cross-party pro-European campaign, the changes to the UK's EEC arrangement, although mostly cosmetic, they helped convince voters by a two-thirds majority to remain. So there wasn't much polarisation in the end. I think David Cameron was hoping for a similar dynamic in this referendum. That is, the goal of his renegotiation was to create momentum to persuade sceptical voters about the economic benefits of remaining. However, this time round, it seems as if there are fewer wavering voters who can be convinced that the economy is what matters above all. The best explanation for this change is the role played by immigration in public understanding of the EU. Immigration from Europe was not at all a concern back in 1975. The UK in the 1970s was not a particularly dynamic economy, and in fact, emigration to Europe and elsewhere was more of an issue. This situation has altered radically, which is why the Leave camp emphasise how far the single market restricts UK control over immigration policy. Now, this strategy is obviously working very well with those for whom immigration matters more than the economy. To understand the trouble the Remain campaign is having in focusing on the economy, there's another interesting comparison we can make. This figure comes from a pollster who has taken YouGov data and contrasted the position of voters in Scotland 1 month before the 2014 independence referendum with public opinion for the UK referendum with 1 month to go. What does it show? Well, the way I read it is that the Remain camp has its work cut out if it wants to win by talking solely about the economy. This was definitely the strategy used by unionists, i.e. those who wanted Scotland to remain in the UK back in 2014. Their campaign, which was dubbed Project Fear by supporters of Scottish independence, a slogan also being used now in the EU referendum, that was based on persuading voters that staying in the UK made the most sense from an economic perspective. And here we have evidence about how this message clearly resonated. 42% of people in Scotland thought they would be worse off in the event of independence from the UK. Now, the story with the EU referendum, looking at the data, appears quite different, as only 21% of people report thinking that leaving the EU will have negative economic consequences. There is nearly a majority who think there will be no difference between being inside or out, which was not the case for the Scottish vote. In the end, 55% of Scots voted to stay in the UK. So that was quite close, and for many, the determining factor in voting this way was concern about economic uncertainty in the event of changing the status quo. Remember that it was David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister, who authorised the Scottish referendum and helped plan the Unionist campaign. Hence, we can see why there might be similarities with the current EU referendum. However, the renegotiation with the EU has come and gone, as have numerous interventions by a number of foreign leaders and big financial figures. Yet the message about Brexit inevitably creating economic uncertainty does not seem to be having the same effect as in the Scottish referendum. This is despite the very strong rhetoric used about how leaving the EU would detonate an economic bomb or create a DIY recession in the UK. Those are the words of David Cameron. So a question that naturally poses itself is why this part of the Remain message has a limited success. In the discussion forum for this week, I'd be interested in knowing whether you think this is because politicians and their forecasts cannot be trusted. What's also significant in this context is that Boris Johnson, a leading advocate of leaving the EU, has specifically linked the question of trust in politicians to their ability to control immigration. He said, and I quote, "It is deeply corrosive of popular trust in politics that every year people in power say they can cut immigration." This is an implicit reference to Cameron, who has made exactly such a promise. So the tactic, which appears rather successful, is for the Leave camp to play up the lack of trust in politicians in general to cast doubt over their forecasting of the economic risks surrounding Brexit. The last point I'd like to make in this lecture is about turnout. Turnout means the number of registered voters who actually cast a vote. It's going to be a vital factor in this referendum as turnout rates differ greatly across categories of voters. The over 60s, for instance, are far more likely to vote than those under 25. The more young people refrain from voting, the more likely the outcome could be a vote to leave the EU, given the way different age groups think about the EU, as we saw earlier. The last point I'd like to make in this lecture is about turnout. Turnout means the number of registered voters who actually cast a vote. It's going to be a vital factor in this referendum as turnout rates differ greatly across categories of voters. The over 60s, for instance, are far more likely to vote than those under 25. The more young people refrain from voting, the more likely the outcome could be a vote to leave the EU, given the way different age groups think about the benefits of EU membership, as we saw earlier. If you're interested in the way that turnout could affect the result, I recommend using the forecasting tool made available by the polling organisation YouGov. The web link details are indicated in this slide. And what the slide shows is a prediction of the result if we assume a 3% lead in the polls for Remain and a 65% level of overall turnout, which indeed is the level of turnout for the 1975 referendum. What's interesting here is that this combination leads to a dead heat, 50-50. And if you go to their site, you can play around with this forecasting tool by changing some of the parameters and seeing how that affects the eventual outcome. But in any case, it really does look like every single vote will count in this referendum. So let's briefly recap the information from this week's lecture. I think the first important thing to recall is the way that public opinion in the UK has become polarised over the EU. The result, although there are significant regional differences, is a rather even split in terms of the core vote on both sides. We also examined how various categories of voters have different preferences about staying in the EU or not. But beyond socio-economic factors, the key dividing line is between people concerned about the economy and those who want more control over immigration. The fact that there are so many of the latter explains why this vote is so close. Moreover, the Leave camp is effective in using the issue of trust in politicians to undermine the pro-EU message. After all, arguments from the Remain camp always come back to the economic risks of leaving, and this message is simply not having as strong an effect as intended. So I think it's fair to expect an extremely tight vote, perhaps closer than the 55-45% split for the Scottish independence referendum in 2014.